So my name is Daniel Barber. I'm a PhD candidate here at Columbia in architecture. And I'll be introducing our third panel of the day and second to last panel of this fabulous two-day event under the title of Scales of Reconfiguration, City, Region, and State. So I just want to point out a few very broad sort of framing issues as is the custom to introduce the panel. And then, again, as has been the custom, go introduce everybody one by one and let them come up and give their papers. So the only first sort of thing I want to point out is that our title recalls and somewhat inverts, right, the discourse on Patrick Getty's 1909 Valley section as it was sort of resuscitated in the 50s by Team 10. And I think, of course, Team 10 has been, relative to this question of kind of state activity, has been part of our discussions all along. So first in the Dorn Manifesto in 54, and then at CM10, this valley section in which the scales of association, right, were intended to produce new criteria for urban and rural integration, and also new opportunities for building design. And again, we saw some of this, especially last night in Mark Crinson's fascinating lecture. So if we can all sort of imagine, right, this collectively sort of project the Team 10 version of the scales of association onto the screen here, and I'll just talk about it for 1 second. Most of, we're most familiar perhaps with the Smithson's version of it, as presented at Dubrovnik, which traces a valley, following Getty's initial drawing, traces a valley from the isolate up at the top to the village, to the town, and to the city, right? So this sort of V shape that then goes back up from city to town to village. And the Smithson's imperative in this regard is, again, one of the sort of founding moments of Team 10, to develop, as they put it, working parties to operate in a field rather than a point, right? So to approach this drawing as a sort of imperative to develop a new way of engaging questions of city and region and town and really a field of architectural operation. As we know, the sort of familiar story of this, the transformation then of the four sort of points of the Athens Charter into the scales of association. So what's interesting for us here is that what was for Getty's a diagram of a sort of changing distribution of labor, right, according to the process of industrialization as it was occurring surrounding the turn of the century, is for Team 10, Smithson's in particular, a sort of redistribution of operative fields, right? So it's a question of sort of reconfiguring the labor of architecture in that regard, articulating new design opportunities according to the familiar tropes of the post-war discussions of habitat, and as we saw last night, the man on the street, everyday life, et cetera. More sort of, oops, I always forget to put on both sides. An interrogation of relationships between these typological proposals of modernist urbanism, of the problematics of density and circulation, and the multifaceted engagement with anthropological and social scientific models, right, all on the table for this reconfiguration in the 1950s. So our inversion of this Team 10 interpretation, our sort of 2010 intervention into the 1954 interpretation, right, of this 1909 original drawing, an attempt to see the discourse of the 50s, and again, we're not discussing Team 10 in particular here, but sort of using it as a jumping off point, see the discourse of the 50s as something of a symptomatic response to some issues that we will see in this panel, which is a more direct and sort of explicit engagement with infrastructure. So which is to say, rather than the fields themselves, sort of the transversal cuts across these various fields, scales of association, into the question of the architectural parameters and the challenge to them presented by the infrastructural scale. So that's to say, again, that we can recognize in this sort of imperative taken from the Smithsons, taken sort of against the Smithsons, that recognizing the patterns of association of architectural planning and policy practices that lead to or participate in these various ossifications of infrastructural networks. And through that, perhaps, both sort of producing and limiting forms of life, right? Producing and limiting new ways of existing in this so-called modernized condition. In other words, the state, back to our sort of initial theme, the state as either entity or mirage, perhaps, as a component of the production of subjectivity, comes to be constructed and even produced as a consequence of these ossifications, right, of these sort of architectural / infrastructural interventions. And at the same time, how infrastructure, as a sort of tantalizing combination for the design fields, complicating, as we'll see in these papers in various ways, economics, technology, population management, and even, perhaps aesthetics, in this sense, is sort of this tantalizing imbrication, right? This process of interpolating architectural practices in both the formation of the state and the formation of subjectivity. So in this sense, while we might anticipate that by both broadening our scale, right, sort of taking a broad scale as our object, and also by emphasizing the scale itself, right, that the role of the state as a political entity might sort of come into a different set of resolutions, perhaps even be clarified. Well, we find that, thankfully, this is not really the case, but rather that by insisting on scales of operations, we sort of burrow further into the problematics of state practices and design culture, as we'll see played out in a number of very interesting developments through the 3 papers this afternoon. Okay, so with that sort of general framing mechanism, I'll introduce the 3 speakers again in order and then let them come up and make their presentation. Our first speaker is Arturo Almondoz, a professor of architecture at the Universidad Simón Bolívar in Caracas and at the Universidad Católica de Chile in Santiago. He's the author of numerous books and articles, including Urbanismo Europeo in Caracas, 1870 to 1940, I won't try the numbers, an editor of Planning Latin America's Capital Cities, 1850 to 1950. His paper today will be Showcases of Development, State, Urban Modernism, and Regional Planning in Latin America, 1930s to 1950s. Our next speaker will be João Rafael Santos, lecturer and PhD candidate at the Faculdade de Arquitectura at the Universidade Técnica de Lisboa. He will present the paper, there we go, The Infrastructural Metropolis, Lisbon, 1904 to 1967. And finally, we will hear from Zvi Efrat, the director of the School of Architecture at the Bezalel Academy of Arts and Design in Jerusalem and partner in Efrat Kowalski Architects. The title of his paper, The Architectural Fabrication of Israel. So if you'll join me in welcoming all 3 of our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I would like to start by thanking the organizers for the event, which has been very rewarding indeed, and also by, letting you know that this is a paper drawn from a research line that I have developed. It's called Urban Modernization in Latin America from the mid-19th century through the mid-20th century. And today I'm going to focus on an episode about what I have called the showcases of development, in which I will try to sort of contextualize modernism or modernismo in relation to the processes of urbanization, industrialization, and developmentalism or desarrollismo. From a panoramic and comparative perspective, the paper aims at explaining the relationships between some of Latin America's nationalist and corporate states and their urban and territorial expressions in the golden age of the region's development policy and modernization. 2 main streams will allow decorated, so to speak, these spatial showcases of desarrollismo. I'm not sure whether the term for desarrollismo is developmentalism, but anyway, this is the policy that I will try to use. Firstly, emphasizing the transition from the European-oriented and academic design of the first urban plans to the definite adoption of functional modernism by the 1940s. And secondly, the incorporation of a mainly North American-oriented technique of planning on a regional scale. The first section I'm going to focus on is I call it neither development nor modernization, and I'm trying just to do that initial contextualization of the process that I think is very, it could be interesting. By the 1920s, Latin America's biggest countries boasted 2 citizens per each peasant that had remained in the backward pampas, llanos, or sertões, of their vast countryside. This is, of course, a gross indicator that camouflages a sharply contrastive reality, as most of what has to do with this continent, in which Argentina and the southern cone had more than 50% of its population urbanized since 1914, whereas Andean or Central American countries were predominantly rural until the 1950s. In a few decades of the 20th century, Latin American countries completed a cycle that had taken more than 100 years in Britain and other nations that industrialized and urbanized throughout the 19th century. And this is why I have included this sort of comparison here of the curves of urbanization in both industrialized and third world countries in the 19th and 20th century as a sort of very simplified comparison of the demographic transition cycle as well. From the end of the Second World War until the mid-1960s, Latin America's biggest countries showed a relative prosperity marked by significant economic expansion amidst sustained urbanization. Fueled by the massive markets targeted by the import substitution industrialization, or ISI, Brazil and Mexico reached a yearly growth of 6%, what made them appear by the 1950s and 1960s, respectively, as model economies of the so-called taking off towards development in terms, of course, of Walt Whitman Brostow's famous theory of development, which was very much in fashion by then in Latin America among political and economic milieux. The modernizing climate was promoted, and I have also included just a general image of, for instance, the booming growth of Buenos Aires by the late 1930s with major works in Avenida de Mayo and so forth. The modernizing climate was penetrated by an economic nationalism that was shared with heterodoxy by Latin America's socialism and liberalism, democracies and dictatorships alike. It ranged from the populist regimes of Mexico's Lázaro Cárdenas, Argentina's Juan de Perón, and Brazil's Getúlio Vargas, to the progressive yet brutal dictatorships of Cuba's Fulgencio Batista and Venezuela's Marcos Pérez Jiménez. Their common agenda of desarrollismo was backed since 1948 by the creation of international agencies such as the Organization of American States, the OAS, and the Economic Commission for Latin America. I don't know whether it's ECLA or ICLA, both sponsored by the United Nations and the US's growing interest in the region's primary and industrial exploitation. And of course, OAS and ECLA were very much in favor of bolstering this program of desarrollismo by those years. While being regarded as promising examples of developing countries, a category that seemed to have great resonance until the 1960s, most of Latin America's industrializing societies seem to be exponent of the classic theory of modernization as it was explained by the models of economic growth and functional sociology. From the early 60s, the connection between industrialization, urbanization, and modernization was formulated following an almost causal derivation by Leonard Reisman and Kingsley Davis, for instance, from the standpoints of social change and demographic transition, relying on the examples of the North Atlantic countries that had industrialized in the 19th century. From that literature could be deduced that Latin America's developing nations appear to be in the path towards urbanization and industrialization, but they actually suffered from profound distortions by comparison with successful experiences of modernization in Europe, North America, and other parts of the world, as it was studied for instance, by Philip Hauser in the early 1960s. Distortions or differences could be gathered in two groups. On the one hand, a fledgling industrialization had not preceded, but rather followed urbanization in Latin America, so the ISI was not the equivalent of an industrial revolution with its dynamic effects on the economic system and demographic transition. On the other hand, levels of urbanization almost double industrial participation in the economies of Argentina, Chile, Venezuela, Colombia, and Brazil, according to 1950s censuses. In the decades to come, this surplus of unproductive population living in cities had to take refuge in slums, shanty towns, and the informal economy. But it was already clear by the late 1960s that neither development nor modernization understood as the outcome of ECLA-like developmentalism and functionalist sociology would be possible anymore, given Latin America's imbalance between industrialization and urbanization. And I have also included an image of one of the emblematic projects of the Pérez Jiménez administration in Venezuela in the 1950s, the 23 de Enero superblocks, which were already surrounded by the late 1960s by shanty towns that, of course, have developed much more since then. I'm going to focus now on changes of modernism as a showcase within this context. While developmentalism remained elusive in economic and social terms, some of Latin America's metropolises strive to exhibit a modernist image that, in view of the imbalance between industrialization and urbanization, also resulted incomplete and distorted. But it must be recognized that architectural modernism was a showcase for displaying the rapid modernization pursued by economic developmentalism, whose nationalist ingredients color vernacular and genuine modernismos in some of Latin America's developing countries. I'm not going to refer here to sort of architectural examples, which in fact have been addressed to in previous presentations. I'm just passing to sort of the domain of planning. In the domain of urbanism, major foreign influences in post-war Latin America shifted from academicism to functionalist modernism, which served, like developmentalism and industrialization, to the progressive goals of democracies and dictatorships likewise. In consonance with the search for a socialist architecture since the administration of Álvaro Obregón in Mexico in the early 1920s, displayed in an ambitious program of public hospitals and schools sponsored by Minister José Vasconcelos and designed, for instance, by Juan O'Gorman, José Villagrán, and Juan Legarreta, and I think we have here one of O'Gorman's schools. Heinrich Mayer's left-wing rationalism was introduced and bolstered in Mexico during the 1939-49 stay of the former Bauhaus director. Prior to that, although it cannot be considered an academic plan, the Plano Regulador of the Federal District, coordinated by Carlos Contreras, pioneer of Mexico's urbanismo, or planeación, as it is also called, was closer to the tradition of Thomas Adams's regional plan for New York, partly as a consequence of the fact that the Mexican architect had studied in Columbia University and was trained in New York, in the New York Plans Regional Office from 1919 through 1925. And we can see here the plan coordinated by Carlos Contreras. The modern legacy in all the Latin American capitals was enriched during the 1940s, especially through the visits of luminaries from the International Congresses of Modern Architecture, SIAM, that advised the new planning institutions, some of which came to have national competence. I'm not going to refer here to the episode of Le Corbusier's first visit, okay, to Argentina and to the Southern Cone, because I was told to sort of reduce the presentation. But it's just an image that reminds that fundamental visit of Le Corbusier in the late 1920s. SIAM's theoretical presence in Latin America would be consolidated with the Spanish edition of the 1941 Charte d'Athènes, published in Argentina in 1954, completed with its Cuban adaptation in Martínez Inclán's Código de Urbanismo. After visits to Havana of modernist maestros such as Richard Neutra, Walter Gropius, and Joseph Albers, SIAM's leadership among generations of Cuban architects was took over by José Luis Sert, advisor of the new Junta Nacional de Planificación, or National Board of Planning, created in 1955 by Batista's dictatorship. In the 1957 master plan proposed by the Catalan urbanist, Jean-Claude Nicolas Forestier's 1920s image of Havana as a sort of Nice of the Caribbean, whose plan we can see here to the left, was replaced by a proposal surrounded by the myth of Las Vegas or Miami, aimed at creating a regional center for tourism that included a complex of hotels, a business city in the style of Le Corbusier, and Siam-inspired grids for the working class residential suburbs. And we can see Serre's plans to the right with some of the type blocks that were proposed. Having arrived from the late 1940s in Venezuela, but especially during Pérez Jiménez's dictatorship, which took place in the 1950s until 1958, planning was advocated by Sert himself, Robert Moses, Francis Violich, and Maurice Rotival again, all of them advisors of the Comisión Nacional de Urbanismo, or National Commission of Planning. The French visitor, Rotival, left testimonies of the rise of the new planning technique in the post-war years, what contrasted with his more academic stance during his stay in the late 1930s, when he had coordinated the first urban plan for Caracas. And there is an image of the first plan to the top to the right, which was a much more academic, a sort of Beaux-Arts-inspired plan. And I have forgot to mention that, of course, we have here Pérez Jiménez going out of one of the leading institution of the period, the Banco Obrero, no? Which was very much advocated to housing. Hired for the second time by the Venezuelan government, Rotival did not wish to be considered any longer as urbanista, but as a representative of the more comprehensive professional that the planificateur was supposed to be, according to a differentiation that he would theorize about some years later. I have some reference also in the conference, in the text to Violich, but I'm just to skip it for the sake of the time. In the case of Brazil, and there is also the image of the Plano Regulador de Caracas, which was promoted by the Comisión Nacional de Urbanismo, which was a sort of modernist plan published in 1951 using sort of Siam concepts, like neighborhood units, etc. And to the right, we have the image of a neighborhood unit designed by Serres for one of the oil camps in Venezuela, in the inland Venezuela. In the case of Brazil, after the introduction of international modernism to Sao Paulo in 1923 by the Russian Gregory Barchachik, Siam representatives and Le Corbusier's proposal for Rio fueled the functionalist momentum that would reach its peak in Costas and Niemeyer Brasilias, of course. After the sketches of viaducts serving as high-rise residences at the same time, which were produced during the 1929 visit, Le Corbusier went back in 1936 to Brazil, where some of his proposals were more contextualized, including the building of the Ministry of Health and of Education and Health, which was referred to yesterday in the presentation about South Africa. Imbued with the industrialism and developmentalism of those decades, another experience that confirms Brazil's fascination with Siam's functionalism was the Cidade dos Motores, or City of Engines, as a 25,000 people settlement that would provide services for an aeronautic factory northwards of Rio. The functionalist momentum would reach its climax in the following decade, when the new capital city, promoted by President Juscelino Kubitschek, was completely undertaken by a national team led by Lucio Costa and Oscar Niemeyer. It was finally evidenced that the professional maturity of Brazilian architecture and planning were able to internationally resound without the presence of foreign maestros. Having worked with Kubitschek when he was mayor of Belo Horizonte, Niemeyer was responsible for many of Brazilia's buildings laid out over Costa's plan, whose aircraft-like shape has been interpreted not only as a reference to the Siam fetish and the rationality of the Roman castrum, but also as an allusion to Brazil's takeoff and drive to development by those years. The transition from urbanismo to planejamento in Brazil was sped up by Father José Lebret's visit to Sao Paulo and other Brazilian cities, where he advocated the principles and variables of regional and economic planning as a new technique to deal with the sprawl of metropolitan areas. The awareness of new approaches to regional planning in the professional milieu was evidenced in the criticism against the Brazilian plan for not having incorporated more economists, ecologists, and social scientists, as it was spelled out by the anthropologist Gilberto Freire, a leading voice of Brazil's social sciences. Costa's reply was not only clever, I think, but also representative of a turning point of the discipline. The new capital city was not supposed to be, Costa said, the outcome, but the cause or the origin of a regional plan, okay? And I'm going to move to the last section. We have time, don't we? In which I will try to sort of summarize this transition, the urbanismo and planning to city, and planning and city and region. It is not a coincidence that the use of the term urbanismo during the first decades of the 20th century in Latin America was replaced after the Second World War by planificación, or planeamiento in Spanish, and by planejamento in Portuguese. There are some considerations that I include here, but there are some nuances which make that they are not mere synonyms. They have a sort of technical connotation. Well, although, and one can trace that a bit historically, you know? Although Karl Brunner, which we can see here to the left, Karl Brunner's famous Manual de Urbanismo, published in Bogotá in 1939-1940, did not emphasize the region as a territorial ambit, it did recognize regional planning as a new technique whose antecedents dated back to Schmidt's planning of the Ruhr Basin and Geddes' civic studies for Edinburgh. But contemporary breakthroughs, according to the Austrian urbanist, that worked in Chile and Colombia from the 1920s until the late 1930s, were mainly illustrated by experiences of the Regional Planning Association of America in New York and in California. Regional considerations had been incorporated, of course, to the contextual studies and theoretical frameworks of some of the first local plans of Latin American capitals, from Contreras's and De La Paulera's plan for Mexico City and Buenos Aires, respectively, to Agaches and Rotival's plan for Rio and Caracas. And we can see De La Paulera right to the top, and his first proposal of a regional plan for Buenos Aires, elaborated from the local office created in the mid-1920s. Sorry for not having included the captions in all the cases. Having arrived mainly from the USA through those representatives were European maestros like Rotival or Sert, and I think that in this morning's presentation about Sert, it was made a comment about this perception of these maestros as sort of American-oriented maestros in the local milieus. The regional planning and Siam functionalism continued amalgamating the diverse methodological influences that define the emerging planification. Ranging from economic and social to regional and systemic variants, those mainstreams were combined in different ways in Latin America's planning institutions, which expanded from the local to the national scale. It seemed that in this continent was being materialized the institutionalization that Siam had experienced after the Second World War, which had made the movement turn from leading the vanguard to representing the establishment. And I just want to conclude that there are exceptions, of course, and there are different treatments of the term. For instance, planeamiento in Mexico always had a different, was used from the very beginning. But there was in the long term a sort of unification of the term planificación with this new sort of conception of modernity coming from the USA after the Second World War. In the heyday, I just want to conclude by saying, so that in the heyday of developmentalism, Latin America's planificación and planejamiento ended up not only being associated with techniques and ambits drawn from regional planning, but also defined by its relationship with political, economic, and social aims and goals, as it happened in other parts of the world during the 1960s. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Firstly, I would like to thank the opportunity to be here with all of you and to share common interests. And the presentation I'm bringing today is part of an ongoing PhD research in urbanism addressing the morphological interpretation of the metropolitan region of Lisbon in Portugal from an infrastructural matrix. It aims at bringing forward the processes where and by which infrastructure and territory are combined at specifically metropolitan morphologies. So the core focus of my presentation or of my research is not particularly theory or history, but I'm hoping to have some useful contribution to the discussion. Let's see. So firstly, a short overview of the presentation, which is structured in 3 points, the first of which addresses the date of 1940, a date with specific interest because it congregates various public works in Lisbon which have or which offer a metropolitan vision. Secondly, 1967 is the date in which the last comprehensive municipal master plan for Lisbon is made before the democratic revolution of 1974, and finally a short discussion on the territorial transformations in between. So in 1940, we have to firstly acknowledge that Portugal was coming through a dictatorship starting in 1933, which lasted until 1974, which called itself the new state, the Estado Novo. The political agenda behind such regime claimed the identitary rebirth of the nation through authoritarian practice and centralized state institutions. Infrastructure development and modernization were key to this agenda. The architecture and planning practice were instrumental in, for instance, the public works as expression of political initiative of the regime, and they were also areas where design innovations could be associated to this new infrastructural apparatus. In other cases, it was being difficult to introduce design innovations, for instance, associated with modernism, but infrastructure was one of the areas where such an expression could be introduced. Urbanization was also taken as a central role of the state, countering current practice until then. The first slide with some pictures which illustrate this conservative and rather patronizing agenda of Estado Novo come from a very peculiar drawings made for elementary school manuals, which showed the lesson of Salazar, the head of the political regime. In these pictures we show the claim for a traditional architecture and domestic family values associated with the state transformation operated by Estado Novo. It also expresses the infrastructural modernization in the lower pictures associated with its political agenda. Now, drafting or tracing or cartographing the territorial transformations occurring during this, the initial stages of Estado Novo, from 1900 to 1940, we see the first steps on programming a city expansion to the north. So instead of having just a highly centralized historical center, during this period, a number of initiatives are being drawn to program the city expansion and to define a pre-metropolitan frame for which public infrastructure, public works are vital. So going beyond the city boundaries, the metropolitan scale can be associated with a number of public works, for which I'm just showing 3 of them. Let's see if I can show them here. Sorry. The first of which is Monsanto Forest Park, a hill to the west of the city which was unforested until then. The Costa do Sol, which is this coast to the west, and a new highway which was being programmed to develop this entire region, and the waterfront road going through the Atlantic Ocean. The first of these planning initiatives, the Costa do Sol master plan, was mainly based on a dual approach to infrastructure. First, a very definitive structure accompanying the coastline with 2 axes, which rendered a frame for metropolitan expansion, and then a second highly detailed zoning master plans for local areas around and in between of these infrastructures. The way how this highway was introduced into the city is particularly evident of how architecture and infrastructure are combined. For instance, the very functional and structural elements of this bridge reaching the city, and then a more monumental celebration of public space with a highly detailed and monumental area for sightseeing and belvedereing. Nowadays, it isn't used like this, and this area was never built. Nevertheless, the road was becoming a key landscape and architectural concern. For instance, in the marginal, in Estrada Marginal, the waterfront roadway, which I have shown you in the previous slide, we can see an entanglement of landscape with infrastructure, defining a new perceptual and cultural references for the city life. The detail and architectural quality of such design is also a remark of how these roads were designed. They were programmed by the National Board of Roads, one of the state central institutions drafted by the new state, which for the first time incorporated architects with the specific aim of improving the landscape quality of road design. So a new landscape started to be perceived and assimilated mostly by the car. The car was a key important factor in this perception. So belvederes, the scenic pathways, and even more detailed traffic signage was part of this new landscape, a landscape which was starting to become infrastructural. This is also the time during which new planning paradigms are being integrated into Portuguese urban planning. In here we have the Municipal Master Plan of Lisbon, which was being elaborated from 1938 to 1948, in which we can see the importance of landscape in combination with infrastructure. For instance, the parkways, which define zoning sectors, and parkways was a specific term used by the architect Etienne de Groer, a French-Hungarian architect which studied in Paris. He draws the term parkways into the memoir of the master plan. So it's a rather eclectic formation behind this approach. Also, a bounding green belt was to be built around the city, for which the Monsanto Park was one of the key instruments of this green belt. It is also interesting to see one diagram taken from Etienne de Groer in a memoir he has made, in which he defines a theoretical model for a city with satellite cities. It's very close resemblance with Howard's own diagram. These new paradigms of urban and metropolitan development and its planning can also be associated with the distribution, the regional distribution of activities. For instance, the leisure and sports facilities associated also with nationalist celebrations, like, for instance, the National Stadium to the west of Monsanto. All of these works, as I was saying before, had in some degree the involvement of architects working also in central public works authorities. This involvement allowed for architects to play an active role in the diversity and scale and scope of intervention. It was also the background from which it was possible to introduce some design innovations, namely of some modern references. In this case, these three pictures show three works done by architect Paulo Cunha, which was working in the Port Authority of Lisbon, where we can see that he was able to define and to develop spatial layouts and more detailed architectonic features designed for port areas in which modern references are clearly introduced. In another set, outside of these infrastructural works, we can see that the design, the comprehensive urban planning and design is facing a more slow transition from formal urban expansion, gridded sectors, to a modern development based on housing neighborhoods. This case is the neighborhood of Alvalade, where we can see the definition of a grid establishing housing neighborhoods, but still accommodating for a rather formal urban design. However, it is also possible to detect the different typologies and design innovations which are being introduced in transition between 1940 and later on 1967. So, going to 1967, it's important to address the context, which is mainly based on the changing role of the state, which no longer will be the sole provider of infrastructure and housing development, but it will focus singly in infrastructure, relinquishing the extensive expropriation powers that it had gained in the previous period and the housing development to private sector. It also focuses on an economic policy based on industrial sectors. The building industry, the chemical industry are associated with the most important planning developments. This cartography shows the intensification of suburbanization during the period from 1940 to 1967. It also shows the unequal urban development occurring inside the city, the municipal boundary, which is here, inside of which there is a substantial work done by architects, municipal architects, young, fresh-minded architects, which can accommodate for the introduction of new references, and also they can work in previously expropriated land. So the implementation is not difficult. However, outside of these areas, along the suburbanization axis, that quality, the spatial and architectonic quality, is much poorer. infrastructure provision is also much poorer outside of Lisbon. So infrastructure, one can say, that is starting to get behind of the metropolitan development. Now, one of these pictures show the two neighborhoods developed in the northern part of Lisbon, which show exactly this transition to a modern reference, although seasoned with North European references, which have very qualified public-led housing development, and where open space becomes the ground for freestanding building. So this is the starting point of a disruption between infrastructure and urban design. This disruption can also be seen in the Municipal Master Plan of 1967, where we can see the rise of sectorial-led urban planning. High-capacity transportation becomes the planning backbone, as we can see in the middle picture, namely by the introduction of a new bridge to the south bank of the river. Zoning segregation and morphological disruption accompany this transition, which can be seen in the areas which I was mentioning earlier, the areas outside of the municipal boundary or in its limits, such as Benfica, which has a plan which is partially executed, but which is much more based on a less elaborate urban design based on infrastructure only and no longer the buildings. This other plan, which was not implemented, shows also this kind of morphological disruption. Unlike the previous one, the one to the left, we can see a number of buildings expressively designed, but with very little expression on the infrastructural support behind it. In fact, this large open rectangle here would be a new central train station for the city. It was never built, but look how the plan almost ignores the presence of this planned railway station. And so this starts to be the background for urban or metropolitan development. The disruption is no longer, the disruption comes also from the inability of planning to cope with housing demand, the rise of a laissez-faire approach to private development, which produces a disrupted landscape in which infrastructure and housing are no longer accommodated into a comprehensive planning. This is also the time during which the first regional plan is drawn, 1964. So this is the first metropolitan plan for the entire region. It is focused mainly on infrastructure, settlement, the settlement patterns, and the emphasis on landscape and touristical areas. Its main strategies were of urban containment and functional deconcentration, namely of industrial areas to the south bank. And we can say that it became the first truly metropolitan plan because it also incorporated a number of ring roads working as deconcentration corridors to the rest of the metropolitan area. Some of these infrastructures took almost 40 years to build. And this time gap is in fact a quite important data. So a short discussion on the territorial transformations we can see from these two time periods. In 1940 we witness a pre-metropolitan planning with great formal detail at local scales and a more schematic approach at larger ones. The role of the architect was of building a spatial and cultural identity through design and specifically with public works. In 1967 we witness a change of this role and of this condition with the collapse of recalling what Graham and Marvin have called the modern infrastructural ideal. The time and the financial gap between planning and implementation becomes a very important topic to address, because it's no longer the state with its ability to have all the infrastructural and the housing and the industrial provision working together at the same time. And so inequalities from center to peripheral areas are starting to increase. The role of the architecture during this, in the 60s is also changing. It becomes more sectorial minded, disciplinary, separated from infrastructure, and so we witness a design splintering of infrastructure and the architectonic object. Just to trace and to bring such points within a metropolitan development since then, we can see that from 1967 to 1992, we have seen extensive urban growth escaping formal planning, especially in these areas, and great difficulties in infrastructural development. Much of the urban initiatives drawn in the 1964 Metropolitan Plan was not built in this period, 1992, or not still built. They were built later on in the late 20th century, in which we can see finally more mature stabilization of infrastructure, bringing a more polycentric region, a redevelopment around ring roads, but also a continuing difficulty in closing the gap between public planning and private development. The next step in this development will probably bring a new scale of operation to the metropolis with the introduction of high-speed train connecting to Madrid, a new bridge, and a new international airport. So the final slide, just for concluding remarks, I would say that infrastructural landscapes are a field of overarching perceptual and cultural implications, which demand a research into the pioneering metropolitan approaches in the 40s. And ultimately, I think we need to elaborate on the disruption between the project of infrastructure and the project of the city. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. I begin my account of the architectural making of the State of Israel with this somewhat elusive image of the National Museum of Israel, designed in 1959 and opened to the public in 1964. I will try today an impossible rhetorical loop in order to embed the iconography of the museum within a larger territorial construct, or rather to read the formative master plan of Israel through the spatial scheme of the museum. This is the museum, the Israel Museum, more or less in its opening in the mid-60s. I will not refer to the beautiful round structure at the right. This is Kistler's Shrine of the Book, and I will also not refer to this beautiful garden designed by Noguchi, only to the cubicle structure on the left. The Israel Museum was conceived as a national art and archaeology museum. It was programmed to be both the stockroom of tangible historical evidence and the showcase of a rejuvenating nation, the sign of its creative force. In 1959, an architectural competition was set up to determine the museum's architect. The winning project by architects Alfred Mansfeld and Dora Gad, in charge of the interiors, was the least presumptuous proposition. It was reductive, rigorous, and at the same time picturesque. The boards submitted to the competition by the architects left no room for misinterpretation regarding their pictorial inspiration. At the top of the first board appeared an analogical sketch depicting an Arab village, specified in writing as the village of Malka near Jerusalem. And below it, drawn in freehand as a mirror image, a perspective and plan of the proposed museum. As we learned from the competition proceedings, it was this sketch, this enchanting homology, that caught the attention of the jury and was the prime reason for the choice of this project. The Arab village of Malka was thus consecrated as the myth of origin, authenticating the National Museum to be. It should be explained that the lands of Malka, a village emptied of its inhabitants during the War of 1948, were confiscated by the Israeli authorities and suspended under the legal definition of deserted property. Its masonry houses were spared and used as temporary accommodations for new Jewish immigrants, usually of North African origins. Later on, during the 60s, the immigrants were engineered into prefab housing projects, while Malka went through a process of gentrification. It was now colonized by resourceful squatters, bohemians of all sorts, who could appreciate its beauty and convert its legal status in order to buy the houses, and established an artist colony that would cancel out any possible quest for return by the original owners. This image describes such a situation in a nearby village in Ankara near Jerusalem. We see here new Jewish immigrants entering deserted or destroyed Arab houses. Against such actual process of expropriation, it is hardly surprising to find the ghostly image of Malka emerging in architectural drawings as their poetic truth factor. For most of the Israeli cultural community, the Arab village did not represent antagonistic reality or political conflict. It was the sign of the sensuous native, the soft image of organic, anti-monumental, spontaneous architecture. In fact, many local artists and architects of the time were obsessed with Arab or Mediterranean imagery, but the Israel Museum may be the first and the most celebrated instance of its embodiment in actual built form, a village for a village. A photo collage created by Willem Sandberg, the Israeli Museum's first director, describes the new museum and the vernacular village flattened into one seamless and painless continuum. Sandberg's pre-Photoshop graphics is devoid of any reflexive dimension. It is not an acerbic critique about the technique of montage, nor about the Orientalist gaze of the architect, but rather a trivial fascination with the effects of architectural masquerade that allows the blurring of historical narrative into timelessness and the subversion of war brutality into aesthetic synchronicity. By the way, strangely enough, this image was sold as a poster at the museum store for many, many years. It was a very popular poster. A look at the museum's elevation reveals that alongside the appealing contour of the Arab village, the museum is haunted with yet another image, that of Mies van der Rohe's unbuilt brick house of 1923. But a brief study of the museum's plans reveals that Mies is indeed misappropriated by Mansfeld. The missing and decomposed volumes are valued for the pictorial effect. The freestanding walls and floating planes become, in Mansfeld's plan, modular boxes situated arbitrarily on a topographic matrix. Indeed, the systemic layout and pattern language of the Israel Museum is above all a local dialect of 1950s structuralist architecture. It was mentioned or discussed before in other presentations. Mansfeld, like many Israeli architects of the late 50s and 60s, was directly influenced by Tim 10 and was deeply engaged in the articulation of a new kind of binary thinking which organized base elements into spatial patterns, henceforth referred to as clusters, habitats, beehives, carpets, megaforms, and other rhetorical crossings between the mechanical and the organic. These are other models, still models by Mansfeld, who shows how these structures could grow horizontally and vertically. What is so new and convenient about this terminology is precisely the fact that it is not architecture in the traditional sense of form giving or space making. It rejects the predetermined object and the stable form in favor of an autogeneric system, a system that reproduces, permutates, and adapts itself through time and space. The actual built result, and I believe that the Israel Museum is one of the finest existing built examples anywhere, is an aggregation of modular cells with no definite shape or finite contour. We see still Mansfeld, the same architect, with a completely different scale of thinking. Now it's an urban scale. In fact, the most useful quality of structuralist architecture is its elasticity and expandability on prescribed matrix and according to a predetermined code without changing its genetic code. In the case of the Israel Museum, for example, it grew in size, in area, 10 times since its inception. 10 times. I don't know if there is any precedent for such a building without changing its character or even its appearance. These are still original sketches from the competition, from the original competition in 1959. So behind the soft, weak image of nebulous fragmentation lurks ideological expansionism as a second nature of structuralist architecture. The abandonment of the proper object, of the autonomous figure of the building, opens up the praxis of incremental growth and elusive crawl. Such slow motion always appears more sustainable and moderate because it never entails massive demolition, radical change of scale, or monumental impositions. It evolves through the dissemination of small-scale units, naturalized as it were in the geography, camouflaged as local folklore. But then it spreads like cancer, it covers ground in the most efficient way, it turns the indigenous paradigm into a displacement machine. Mansfeld's title of his own work, Growth, Change, and Uncertainty, summarizes the logic of structuralist architecture at large, but it also provides an astute insight into the principal drive and the guiding politics or logistics of Israeli architecture after the war of 1967. Growth, change, and sure enough, uncertainty is a modus operandi and self-indulging borderline disorder. In this paper, however, I will not further discuss this post-67 tendency. It is well studied and elaborated in the work of Weizmann and Segel, as civilian occupation. Instead, in the context of our conference, I will return to the formative years of Israeli statehood and the architectural scene of origin. I will try to argue first that Israel is a construct, an architectural fabrication, an instant master plan, a brief design that was executed verbatim. And second, that the picturesque village mentality of the National Museum is not at all eccentric, but indeed highly consistent and legible against the background of Zionist rural, provincial, and autochtonic ideology. According to this argument, then, the architecture of the National Museum and the planning of Israel are different scales of a common quest for urgent authenticity, for emblematic organicity, for instant vernacular, for makeshift regionalism, for modular and modulated formlessness. So it's quite different. Maybe the results finally will be very similar to those in Portugal and other places, but the motivation, or at least in my argument, are completely different. All in all, if Zionism is a case of particular interest, it is because it practices architecture to the extreme. It compensates for historical deficiency by hyper-planning. It denies stable form by maintaining an open-ended process of morphing. It draws maps of masquerade over and over again to measure the vulnerability and negotiability of boundaries. So let us now look at the national scale. Contrary to common belief and to visual impression, Israel was not born of haphazard improvisation, emergency solutions, or speculative entrepreneurship, but rather of the unprecedented objective to put into practice one of the most comprehensive, controlled, and efficient architectural experiments in the modern era, Indeed, this may be Israel's singularity among nations or states or nation-states. It was systematically worked out in advance by planning professionals of various disciplines in order to carry out Ben-Gurion's prescript to transform the country, the nation, our entire modes of life. Ben-Gurion, of course, was the first leader or the founder of the state, first prime minister. We see him here in the center, the short man. And you can guess that the taller man behind him with the camera, of course, is the architect that I'm now going to talk about, Ariel Sharon. Precedents and direct references to the Israeli project can be found in Stalin's 5-year plan for the Soviet Union, in the American New Deal infrastructural projects of the 30s, in the German National Socialist regional plans for the occupied territories of Poland, and in the post-war British new towns. I'm just referring to those who were direct influences on the Israeli planners. But its sweeping vision, exceeding all instrumental models and circumstantial explanations, is rooted in the utopian imagination and redemptive praxis of the Zionist movement. These roots call for some elaboration so as to reenact the bedding upon which the master plan of Israel was drafted immediately upon the outbreak of the state. The very notion of Hamifal HaTzioni, or the Zionist enterprise, unfolds the highly institutionalized, explicitly synthetic, and actively constructive nature of the process of land appropriation and nation building by the Jews in the 20th century. You see here, this image is of Nahalar. It's one of the first semi-collective settlements designed by Richard Kaufman. Any attempt to normalize Zionism by overemphasizing aspects such as spontaneous immigration, organic settlement, or market forces misses the point. The artificial essence of Zionism, the grounding of its rhetoric on notions, on such notions as negation, inversion, or synthesis, its self-definition as a constrained, corrective, redemptive, Ben-Gurion even used the term messianic, intervention in historical time and geographical space. In this context, centralized planning is the ultimate trope that binds words and things. It is the Zionist spirit itself, emanating from layers of fictional prose, ideological manifestos, or programmatic protocols, and printed on the landscape over and over again with every new spatial move or architectural object. This is another type of rural settlement. This is a kibbutz. We don't have time here to really explain what it is, but this is really the, referring to a previous presentation here, there are no private kitchens at all, okay? There's no private property. And this is the most radical, this is the avant-garde, the pioneering settlement. The most conspicuous use of centralized planning, not merely for territorial organization, but rather as an apparatus molding a new ethos, is manifested in the consistent efforts to shift the political, cultural, and economic weight from the city to the countryside and from the center to the periphery. As a rule, it may be said that in its 50 years, roughly it's the first half of the 20th century, its first 50 years, the Zionist movement devised and developed a range of pioneering models of agricultural settlements, but never imagined, planned, or actually built a city. In fact, the modern metropolitan city was consistently portrayed in both literary utopias and direct propaganda as an impediment to the Zionist concept of land redemption, a parasitic growth threatening to undermine the fundamental values of the re-emergent Hebrew civilization. What we see here is an image, is a poster from an exhibition, from a basically propaganda exhibition showed at the Tel Aviv Museum already in 1950 by the planners, you can say by the government, by the state, in order to convince people to move from the center to the periphery. So this is one board. We'll see a few more from this exhibition. Thus, revolutionary objectives, totally controlled planning, and a well-coordinated course of action had characterized the Zionist enterprise from its very outset. However, the country's crucial conversion was obtained with the founding, was obtained only with the founding of the sovereign state of Israel and the end of the British mandate in 1948. Only a few weeks after the Declaration of Independence, Ariel Sharon, not to be confused with Ariel Sharon, a Bauhaus graduate and also a great student of Hannes Meyer, who was mentioned before, and which was worked for Hannes Meyer, and I think that he also joined the trip to Moscow that was mentioned before. So this Ariel Sharon from the Bauhaus, who was also one of the prominent architects of Israel's labor movement, was commissioned to establish the governmental planning department. It was immediately, in fact, it was already during the end of the war. The pressing national task assigned to Sharon and his team of planners was providing temporary housing solutions for the masses of new Jewish immigrants and settling the country's borderlands in order to stabilize the 1948 ceasefire lines, prevent territorial concessions, and inhibit the return of Palestinian war refugees. What we see here is really temporary camps. These, by the way, were designed by architects. They were even designed by Louis Kahn and other Jewish American architects for these camps, believe it or not. The planner accomplished this by drafting a statewide network of civil frontiers composed of transit camps, as we see here, and outpost agrarian settlements, as well as by resettling deserted Arab villages with new Jewish immigrants. Here we see new Jewish immigrants in Jaffa, and this is another example of an Arab village. We see already this process of transformation taking place immediately after the war. These are difficult images, but this is the story to be told. Concurrently, a long-term mission was outlined for the planning department, preparing a national master plan. The first draft of this plan, known hereafter as the Sharon Plan, was presented in 1950. Its objectives were targeted at a local population of slightly over 2.5 million inhabitants, which would be dispersed throughout the country. This is an image from Sharon's autobiography, which is called Kibbutz plus Bauhaus. And this is the chapter describing the planning of the new land, new regions, and new towns. While it had no formally approved legal status, the Sharon Plan instantly, within less than a decade, transformed from a principles document to an enormous building project embracing dozens of towns and hundreds of rural settlements, landscapes of national parks, nature resorts, and extensive woodlands, networks of roads, ports, and factories, all entirely new, all designed ex nihilo according to progressive theories and technologies of the time in order to fabricate, synchronize, and monitor a rational and efficient mechanism for organic, regionalist, and quasi-historical settlement. In order to prevent at all costs the development of unruly settlement patterns typical of New World countries or immigration countries, the Sharon Plan chose to emulate the European historic layout whereby the majority of the population dwells in small and medium-sized towns integrated into the agricultural hinterland, and only the minority lives in the big cities. What we see here is, again, one of the posters. The big threat is laissez-faire, okay, in Israel. Because if there'll be a laissez-faire policy, what we see here is that 80% of the new immigrants will live along the shoreline in the big cities. And the whole idea is to move from A to B. This is the idea of the plan, to disperse the population across the country. Needless to say that the origins of this hierarchic web lie in the pre-industrial agrarian culture and reflect centuries of moderate organic growth. The planners of Israel tried to squeeze this process into a single heroic decade, backing their ambitions with intricate pseudo-scientific theories that analyzed the link between settlement patterns and endurance during times of crisis. Especially authoritative for them was the theory of central places, formulated by German geographer Walter Christaller in his 1939 doctoral research. I cannot elaborate on this A very sort of painful issue. You know that the Kristall's plan was used by the Nazis for the occupied territories of Poland. And 10 years after, it was used consciously or not by the Israeli planners. The basic tool suggested by the plan for achieving the desirable European layout was the redivision of the country into 24 districts. No way. Determined according to geographic characteristics and planned as arrays of agricultural settlements, clustered around central villages and served by a regional town. Over 400 agrarian settlements were founded according to the plan's guidelines, more or less the same number of destroyed Arab villages, 400. But its epitome was the new district town, designed as an intimate town of 20,000 to 50,000 residents and assumed to be exempt of the disorientation, alienation, crime, and speculative real estate associated with the cosmopolitan city. I'm just showing it quickly, the plans of these new towns. In the Israeli lab, a new urban paradigm was created, based on the unlikely marriage of a suburban garden city in a Western welfare state and a peripheral industrial town in the outskirts of the Bolshevik Empire. The seemingly paradoxical Zionist attitude of activating a regressive revolution or a pioneering old world may be discerned not only in the rural dispersal of towns and settlements on the map, but also in the attempt to base the architecture of the towns themselves on a conceptual crossbreeding between the mechanistic planning methods, striving to render the traditional city more efficient in terms of mass housing and motor vehicle traffic on one hand, and a pastoral or biomorphic conceptions on the other, willed to tone down the city by fragmenting it into small autonomous communities, protected from street life, zoned off from industrial sectors, and rocked by green surroundings. The smooth, plexing lines of the neighboring units, the abundance of open space within and between them, the placement of education and recreation facilities at the heart of the units amidst lawns and woods, the distancing of industrial areas from living quarters and their separation by green belts, the design of repetitive social housing on undivided land, no parcellation, rather than normative parcelling and speculative construction, all these lead us to the conclusion that the new Israeli town was meant to be a blown-up kibbutz, based on homogeneous community, collective and egalitarian, without private capital or unanticipated market forces. This is an aerial view of a kibbutz. However, unlike the kibbutz, which was created as exclusive and hegemonic structure by and for the members of a social avant-garde, the new town came into being superficially and coercively, a political and strategic doctrine forced upon a population of unsuspecting newcomers, used as passive subject of a national experiment. With the foundation of the first new towns, it became apparent that the progressive zoning principles and the generous ecological aptitude simply do not work. The detached, sparsely populated, ready-made towns weigh down disproportionately on the national budget due to the huge amount of infrastructure they demanded. One more minute, okay? I'll come to the conclusion. 60 years after its official publication, the Sharon Plan still holds its own. The vision of colonization and modernization laid out by the plan has, for the most part, been implemented. Israel has developed at an unprecedented rate of growth. The new town still exists more or less as they had originally been planned. Barren garden cities, lethargic work towns, bypassed regional centers, homogeneous melting pots, underdeveloped urban odds and ends. In conclusion, we may observe that the intricacy of Israel's internal and external boundaries of today is already inscribed at the scene of origin stated by the founders of Zionism. The vision of return to geography and to history outlined an Arcadian utopia, a garden state instantly naturalized amidst biblical landscapes and constantly suspended in a mode of change, growth, and instability. The image of organicity, elasticity, and porosity embalmed in the master plans of dozens of new towns and hundreds of new rural settlements, authenticated, as it were, the texture of homeland and illustrated figuratively the taking place of placemaking. I now return to the National Museum or our initial image of perpetual change, of designed formlessness, of constant displacement and continual dialectics of grounding and ungrounding. This is how it looks today. I mean, this picture was taken a few days ago. Still a building project, still indulging in negotiating its boundaries. Thank you.
Invite you all up to the table. A little time for discussion. Please. So thank you all three of you, for very compelling papers covering a sort of wide array of a number of issues that have been on the table all weekend. I want to, we don't have a lot of time for discussion as we're sort of crunching in towards the end. I want to just sort of ask one question to the three of you, and then we'll open it to the audience for other provocations. And I just want to, in framing this, give you an opportunity to sort of expand on some of the issues that I saw both in reading and hearing your presentations. In terms of how, again, we see the sort of properties and characteristics in this time period, more or less surrounding World War II as the conference is located, characteristics of governance that emerge and sort of become transformed from the state into a variety of non-state or sort of quasi-state practices, right? And in each case, of course, this is inflected somewhat differently. Those practices, of course, including architecture, planning, and sort of territorial organization writ large. How that is accompanied by or is examined through or can be discussed on the terms of transformations of the sort of technical purview of architecture, right? And I saw in all of your papers a sort of from to component, right? So the sort of from the vanguard to the seats of power, from the sort of ornament to sectional planning, and then from showcase to masquerade, right? So these transformations and what they can say, kind of starting with the architect and sort of resonating out to the state level. So, Arturo, do you want to start or do you want another minute?
I'm afraid I have to. Well, yes, I think that in Latin America, well, I'm going to refer to the region in general, please, no? Yeah. Yes. I think that the post-war period is very interesting in the sense that the state, the national state, assume a sort of corporate role. Okay, this corporate role it will involve, I mean, sort of taking on things that, of course, were present in the 19th centuries, in the beginning of the early Republican era, but were taken on in new aspects of economic production, and of course the main activity was industrialization. Okay, so perhaps I didn't emphasize that in my presentation, but we had a first wave of ISI, or industrialization by import substitution, which came from the before the war. Okay, in countries like Argentina and perhaps a bit in Brazil and in Mexico. But there was a second wave by countries like Peru and Venezuela and Colombia, which were after Second World War. And it was a period in which the state sort of created corporations for sort of bolstering production. We have, for instance, the creation of the example of Chile with the Corfo in 1935, which was fundamental for the industrial development until the 1970s, for instance. But apart from I mean, you're most referring to the topics of territory and space. The main point that I see after the Second World War was that the urban issue that was already present in the agenda, in the public agenda, by the mid-1920s, okay? Again, in cities like Buenos Aires and Mexico and in major Brazilian cities, that issue became a national one. I mean, the urban issue within a sort of national framework. And this is why these commissions, like the ones I referred to, the National Commission of Comisión Nacional de Urbanismo in Venezuela, or the Junta de Planificación in Cuba, were no longer local elements, but they had the adscription to the state, with the rank of a ministry, for instance, okay, or a regional corporation. So, you know, I think this sort of assumption of the territorial agenda, the regional agenda within the corporate state, which is to some extent the coordinates that I try to describe, will lead to by the 1960s and 70s to this sort of evolution towards a state that is more a planning state, which is a different phase, I think. And that was very much influenced by the Soviet model, which in many Latin American countries came through France too, through France's influence. So this is, you know, grosso modo.
Okay. Well, okay. As to the governance apparatus, I would say that the first, we can trace two periods in Estado Novo, pre-1940 or 1945, the end of the war. Portugal didn't participate in the war, but was obviously affected by it, and the post-1945. And up until then, in 1945, the main issue was how to build the state, this new state and its institutional apparatus. And I believe that there is, in this process, there is a key person, which I didn't have the time to go into in the presentation, but in the paper it's there, which is the Minister of Public Works from the early 1940s, Duarte Pacheco. He was an engineer, a very committed man with modernization, with some cultural references to the futurism, and it was really a very personalized way of dealing with urban development, infrastructural development. And this man, the Minister of Public Works, establishes a national-wide perspective on these issues, establishing very strong legislation for urban development, giving extensive expropriation powers to the municipalities, for instance, and so it offers, and also it provides a fund to employ unemployed people directly in public works construction. So there is a combination of policies targeted very specifically at infrastructural development, but also with an economical perspective. From 1945 on, in fact, this minister, he dies very young in 1942, and the economical transformations of the country are much more directed at an industrial-based development. The relationships with Europe require that, and the metropolitan approach really is no longer based on a single entity providing all the infrastructure and all the other elements like housing, but focusing more sectorially on specific areas. Transportation, for instance, there is an agency, a national agency for transportation planning, becomes almost a minister on its own. So the relationship that there was with architects were almost chosen personally by the minister in the previous period, so there was a very strong combination between these two levels. It starts to operate in a very stratified and splintered state cartography, let's say it. And the needs to provide industrial background for development is no longer aimed at specific spatial arrangements on cities, towns, even rural improvements, which were very fostered during the 1940s, but are working on a more regional approach. So this scale disruption and morphological disruption has to do with that governance disruption also. So
I think that the Israeli, the Zionist Israeli case is quite particular and complicated in the sense that what is really Israel? I mean, it's not really, it's certainly not first world, it's not third world, it's not also second world. It's not a totalitarian regime. It's social welfare, quite progressive in its own perception. But yet, here Israel comes up with the most ambitious and totalizing project that you could imagine. I don't think that there is any precedent for such a total, let's call it architectural project. And there is almost nothing outside this project, nothing beyond this project for a decade, for the 50s, or for almost 2 decades, 50s and 60s. And it's difficult to explain because, you know, there's supposedly free market economy, architects are free people, you know, the great architects very, very conscious of modern architecture and contemporary theories and technology and so on. But still, there's nothing but state apparatus, state architecture, and this one big project. Everything should conform with this project. And there's almost no opposition, no other ways to do it, to go about it. Moreover, it's certain, it's almost as kind of a survivalist instinct that almost every planning act or every architectural act in this period in Israel has to do with a certain territorial consciousness or territorial intent. I'm saying territorial, of course, meaning is political. You could also say strategic or military, but it's I wouldn't say military because it's always civil settlements, civil occupation. In fact, what we see today, the settlements, you know, beyond the so-called green line in the West Bank and in Gaza, is just a continuation of a practice. That's what I was trying to describe. That goes on like that from the beginning, from the outset of the Zionist settlement in Palestine, in Israel. So this is one issue. Every architectural act is first of all and above all a territorial or spatial sort of process of placemaking, and it's always about this process, and therefore it's always indeterminate in the sense that it will always avoid the object, the form, the boundaries. You know, Israel to this day doesn't have a contour. You know, if you ask an Israeli kid to draw a map, you know, every normal kid in every other state, you know, will do it. An Israeli kid will not know how to do it because it's still undecided. It's still negotiable. So this is one issue. The other issue, of course, is the issue that you mentioned of masquerade, of modern architecture, modernism as masquerade. And again, we don't have time to fully discuss it, but you know, Israel in the 30s, 20s and 30s and 40s and then 50s and 60s as well is a case of really extreme modernism. Tel Aviv is a city of, it's a Bauhaus city, it's so called, and 50s architecture in Israel, it's a highly modernist, more than perhaps other places. You will not find any neoclassicist, you know, regression, so to speak. You know, it's all hardcore. It's kind of contemporaneous with what's going on in Europe. But then it's always modernism without modernization. There was no industrial revolution in Israel. There was no technical modernity. There were no big cities. Again, as I described, Zionism is an anti-urban movement. So it's very critical of modernity. But so I think that modernism, the look, the appearance, the modern appearance, is appropriated by the Zionist movement in a very specific way. I used to write about it, like other people, as a sign of sort of a young nation, you know, and so on. But I think that today I think of it as something that is much more complicated, and this is what I was trying for the first time to bring up in this paper, its relationship with the local, the native, the indigenous, and the dire need, which is above everything else, to authenticate itself instantaneously, to root itself, and to create this kind of quasi-historical presence via modernist language.
May I just add something, because I noticed that perhaps I emphasized too much the point of the corporate state as a producer, but it's also going back to the sort of territorial agenda. That yes, I mean this corporate state is also very much working on the process of regionalization of the country, and this starts after the World War II. And goes, I would say, until the 1970s. And again, this process of regionalization adopts, in some cases, the model of the corporation, in fact, as I think it happened in some cases with the new towns in Britain, as far as I understand. I mean, in order to sort of speed up the process of urbanization of new towns in some regions, the model of the corporation was much more effective than working only with the central administration. So the corporate state also has this sort of territorial front that is working very hard, and it will be in some cases backed in the 1960s, I would say, and 70s, with a legal apparatus of regionalization. I mean, the official creation of regions by decrees, usually, and given to those regional corporations sort of legal status within the central administration.
Well, I think it's very compelling how these questions of sort of modernity, modernism, modernization are sort of inflected in very different ways across this. But I want to open up to questions. Yeah, that's all.
I just want to draw attention to, or bring into focus, the very term region. It seems that we've been using it a little casually, that there is a shift in the idea of region from, state to non-state, and it's something that gives meaning to, it's a term that emerges in the post-war era to give meaning to different processes of change. The idea of region is probably, the question is to Arturo and Joao, that the idea of region professed in Rostow's stages model is that there are a series of fixed stages and you measure the transformation according to this criteria, and whatever doesn't fit that model is seen as disruption. But when we move to emergence of non-state actors, what was previously seen as disruptions become precisely the forces, are considered precisely the forces of which are driving change. So how does the idea of region then changes from something which is, series of layers or series of stages imposed on each other to something which can give meaning to all these forces which were previously seen as disruptive but now seen as productive? Just to give, I guess, one example, I would have used the example of the transformation from Geddes to Smithson's Valley section. Actually, there is a difference. It's not a simple replication. I wish we had the slide. Geddes is shows one mountainside. The settlements are just coming down, and it's seen as an evolutionary diagram. Smithson's replicated, and there are two sides. So it's seen as something which can replicate itself, and it becomes a pattern, and which I think one can argue gives a very different idea of region as something, a continuous transforming dynamic. So I wonder, in your examples, how would you characterize the transformation in the conception of region?
Okay, so in the case of Lisbon, we don't have regions, and we didn't have regions in 1967 or in 1940, which is an interesting debate. We have two levels of government, the national level and the municipal level, and this tension is really something to be a little bit explored. Like I said, in 1964 we had the first regional plan. It was called like that, Plano Diretor da Região de Lisboa, the directive plan for the region of Lisbon. They call it region. Nowadays we call it a metropolitan area, institutionalized by decree, but with really very little powers. So there is no metropolitan level or regional level of power. But you were making this distinction between how this regional approach could be seen as a corrective or a more proactive form of development, of planning, for instance. I would say that in the case of Lisbon, this first plan, 1964 plan, was more of worked both on both ends, both as a corrective instrument to accommodate for a very fast-growing expansion of the city, but without the proper infrastructure to service all of the area. And on the other side, it worked as part of a national policy of progressive planning. There was the national fomento plans, I don't know the translation into English, almost like the Soviet 5-year planning, but in this case associated with the right-wing regime, in which these regional areas played a very voluntaristic approach to industrialization. And so the region was interfacing element in between this national government and the local government, but without having really an institutional level of authority. So it was always something in between the central authority and its abilities or inabilities to control development, and the local level, which was very feeble, which was very weak. Municipal power was very weak, and it was much about private development and its ability to go into specific doors in the national government. So the region is much of an abstraction on the first at the first sight, and also a mere bureaucratic term or concept.
Yes, I think that perhaps the developmentalismo, el desarrollismo in its first moment, perhaps did not work immediately with the apparatus of the region, I think. And perhaps this is very general, no? It could be differences, obviously, between the countries. But what it did sort of spot the sort of national administration working with the developmentalist models was the necessity of backing some regions because of the territorial imbalances and the creation, for instance, of new towns. And in that respect, the idea of regional development was very much associated from the beginning to the desarrollismo. Okay, in the first moment I'm talking about, and I would say, for instance, the development of Brasilia could be, I don't know whether my Brazilian colleagues here could correct me, but for instance, the creation of Nova Cap, which was a corporation which supported the development and the construction of Brasilia was the result of that. Another example would be Ciudad Guayana in the southeast of Venezuela, because by the 1950s, the National Board of Planning that I referred to decided, so to speak, that it was necessary to reinforce the development of the southeast by creating a new city which would sort of counterpart the north coast development of Venezuela, urban development. Okay, so this is why the Ciudad Guayana plan, I don't know whether you are familiar with that plan, but it was sort of developed by the late 1950s and throughout the 60s, in fact, with the support of legal teams from MIT and a sort of very specialized team. But I think that there is a second stage, I would say, and this is a very general periodization. in which the sort of notion of region it's supported by the institutional apparatus and the sort of legal map. And in some countries there was a regional division, as it happened, for instance, in Venezuela. And in this phase that I would say it runs from the 1960s, 1970s. Perhaps in Brazil was earlier. It started in the 1950s with Father Josep Lebret's visits, okay? But in countries probably like medium-sized countries like Venezuela, Colombia, etc., was a process of the 1960s, was very much influenced by people like Lebret, but also by the famous theory of François Peroux, which in fact was very much present in the development of Ciudad Guayana. So this process from the 1960s through the 1970s was, yes, a process supported by an institutional apparatus and the development of regional corporations. And I think that by the late 1970s, the regional apparatus was very much, was started to be dismantled in some cases, okay?
Just a small semantic note, you know, because it's much smaller scale, but I think that maybe in what we've seen today, we may think of regional division. I can't even say this word, regionalization, is sort of a preventive or corrective against regionalism, in a sense. Regionalism may be the disruptive, that which the spontaneous developments, you know, the bureaucratic sort of subdivisions is an attempt to pre-think or premeditate and pre-plan and prevent these kind of local developments. But as we see, you know, it doesn't always work. You know, in the end, you know, in reality, we have always to consider the dialectics between the regional and the regionalist, critical or not. That's because we're here in Colombia. After that, Israel is an interesting case of uncritical regionalism, if anything. You know, this is, in the end, this should have been the title of my lecture, maybe.
So we have time for one more.
Yeah, the question is for Zvi, and again, trying to think about scale again and the transition from one scale to the other. I was wondering whether in that process of moving from the controlled environment of the museum and the production of a relatively small scale of museum building to the national larger scale of the state, what happens in that transition and what opportunity for critical thinking takes place then? Because, for example, we know that Ariel Sharon's nightmare came true, and Israel's 80% of Israel's population is concentrated along the coastal plain. We know, for example, that the development towns and their new towns became a colossal failure. They are nothing of homogeneous ethno-national dreams. They are nightmares.
Interesting that you mentioned, because you know that also Masfeld's nightmare came true. The museum grew up, you know, as I said, as I mentioned, 10 times the size that it was originally designed. The nightmare is even bigger because my office is involved in this project that you've seen. You know, we are now, that's the irony of history, or the irony of the historian, you know, that we end up trying to deal with this kind of thinking. No, of course, it's not really. The example of the museum is not really a critical trope to deal with the planning of Israel, but I was trying, because I had, you know, a 20-minute framework. I was trying to make a single point, and to try to see if we can see the same kind of disorder, or you know, that I call borderline disorder. You know, this attempt to not to deal with the object and with territorial constraints and with boundaries. If I can talk about it through the example of the museum, as if you want a sort of structural image, or even metaphor, in order to explain the larger scale phenomenon in Israel.
It's just, I think it's really important to tread that transition really carefully, because exactly it runs the risk of presenting a monolithic picture of state apparatuses, which several speakers have throughout these 2 days warned against. And again, so it's important to understand exactly the gap between the imagination of architectural and planning imagination and the practices that happen, and that gap.
You know, first, you may disagree with my argument, but first we're dealing here with the 50s and 60s, and the monolithic state apparatus in the 50s is exactly something to be talked about. If you think that of course today, you know, it falls apart, and we see that the patterns of urbanization and settlement are against the grain of the original plan, but we're describing what happened, or the ideas, the intentions, the infrastructure layout of the state, and in a sense, we still see the same impulse, the same effort coming from above to inhabit the periphery. If we have to characterize Israel today as well, we can say that it's a peripheral mentality, or what I call provincial mentality, to this very day. Even if the spontaneous patterns for urbanization are indeed as they feared, you know, along the coast, but still, you know, what would be considered as a good practice, you know, in Israel today, is to go to the periphery, right? You know that. That's what we do, or not you and me perhaps, but that's what is planned today. That's what Israelis are doing. That's what we be considered pioneering, to go to inhabit the periphery.
With this invocation of the periphery, we're well established for the next panel, so we'll take 5 minutes? No? 2 minutes? A minute and a half? Nothing. Do I hear 1 minute?
Yeah, I think that because we're running late and we're about to wrap this thing up, we're going to go on directly to the next panel as soon as we sort out some technical issues. Just bear in mind that there's wine at the end of the tunnel, so I think we can all survive one more. That way we'll have more time for discussion in a round table after we're done. So stay.